Richard Montgomery had built an empire on steel and ambition, but on a gray afternoon at Evergreen Cemetery, the powerful billionaire stood frozen watching a 9-year-old black girl cry at his dead son's grave, whispering apologies that made no sense. And when she ran, leaving behind only a wilted flower and a note signed Lila, thanking Daniel for saving her, Richard felt his carefully constructed world begin to crack, because his son had died 3 years ago in what everyone called an accident, and there should have been no connection between a renowned doctor and this mysterious child. Yet as Richard read those words in childish handwriting, he realized that some secrets refused to stay buried, and this little girl held the key to a truth that would cost him everything he'd built or give him back everything he'd lost. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The afternoon sky hung heavy with gray clouds as Richard Montgomery stepped through the iron gates of Evergreen Cemetery. Rain had fallen earlier that morning, leaving the grass damp and the air thick with the scent of wet earth. He walked the familiar path with slow, deliberate steps, his expensive Italian shoes collecting mud along the edges. This was a journey he made every year without fail, though it never got easier. Richard was 57 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built Montgomery Industries from nothing into a corporate empire. His sharp suits and commanding presence had intimidated boardrooms across the country for decades. But here, in this quiet place among the headstones, none of that mattered. Here, he was simply a father visiting his son's grave. Daniel Montgomery had been dead for 3 years now. 3 years since that terrible car accident had stolen him away at just 28 years old. 3 years of guilt, grief, and questions that would never be answered. Richard rounded the corner past a row of oak trees and stopped short. Someone was already at Daniel's grave. A small figure knelt before the polished granite headstone, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. It was a child. A young girl, perhaps 9 years old, dressed in a crisp navy school uniform with a white collar. Her dark skin contrasted against the pale gray of the stone as she pressed her small hand against Daniel's engraved name. Her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids tied with pink ribbons. Richard stood frozen, watching as the girl whispered something he couldn't quite hear. Then her words reached him clearly through the still air. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner." The voice was soft, broken with emotion. The girl traced the letters of Daniel's name with her fingertips as tears rolled down her cheeks. Richard felt his heart hammering in his chest. Who was this child? How did she know his son? Daniel had been single when he died, focused entirely on his medical work at community clinics. There had been no mention of any children in his life. He took a cautious step forward, a twig snapping under his foot. The sound shattered the quiet moment. The girl's head whipped around, her eyes wide with shock. "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. The girl scrambled to her feet, wiping frantically at her tears. For a moment, their eyes met. Hers were deep brown, filled with something that looked almost like recognition mixed with fear. I have to go," she stammered. "Wait," Richard said, extending a hand. "Please, I just want to know." But she was already running. Her small legs carried her swiftly between the headstones, her school shoes splashing through puddles. Richard considered chasing after her but found his feet rooted to the spot. His body felt too heavy, too old, too confused to move. He looked down at the grave and noticed she had left something behind. A single, wilted yellow flower lay against the base of the headstone, its petals browning at the edges. Beside it was a small piece of paper, folded carefully. Richard bent down, his knees protesting, and picked up the note. The paper was slightly damp from the grass. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was childish, the letters uneven and large. Some words were misspelled, but the message was clear enough. "Thank you, Daniel. You were the nicest person I ever knew. I wish I could have saved you, like you saved me. Lila." Richard read it 3 times, his mind struggling to process the words. Saved her? What did that mean? And who was Lila? He looked up, scanning the cemetery, but the girl had vanished completely. Only the distant sound of traffic beyond the cemetery walls broke the silence. That night, Richard sat in his study, unable to sleep. The note lay on his mahogany desk under the warm glow of his reading lamp. He had stared at it for hours, turning it over and over in his hands as if the paper itself might reveal its secrets. The name Lila echoed in his mind. He knew his son's life better than anyone, or so he had thought. Daniel had been kind-hearted to a fault, always volunteering at free clinics, always giving money to homeless shelters, always choosing compassion over profit. It had been a constant source of tension between them. Richard had wanted Daniel to take over Montgomery Industries, to learn the business, to understand that success required hard decisions and calculated risks. But Daniel had resisted at every turn. He had gone to medical school instead of business school. He had chosen to work in run-down neighborhoods instead of joining the company. Richard remembered their last argument with painful clarity. It had been 2 weeks before the accident. "You're wasting your potential," Richard had said, his voice cold with disappointment. "Working for free, giving everything away. That's not how you build something that lasts." Daniel had looked at him with those calm, steady eyes. "Maybe I don't want to build what you built, Dad. Maybe I want to build something that actually matters to people." Those words had stung. They still did. Now, staring at the note from this mysterious child, Richard wondered how many other lives his son had touched that he knew nothing about. How many other Lilas were out there, mourning Daniel in silence. He reached for his phone and called his assistant, Gerald, despite the late hour. "Mr. Montgomery?" Gerald's voice was groggy with sleep. "Is everything all right?" "I need you to pull some records for me," Richard said. "Check all the scholarship programs under Montgomery Industries. Look for the name Lila. Also search any orphanages or children's charities we've donated to in the past 5 years. Sir, it's almost midnight." "I know what time it is, Gerald. This is important." There was a pause. Then Gerald's voice came back, more alert. "Of course, sir. I'll have something for you by morning." Richard hung up and returned to staring at the note. The name was common enough that the search might turn up nothing useful, but he had to try. Something about that girl's face, the way she had looked at him with such fear and sadness, haunted him. Morning came slowly. Richard had barely slept, his mind replaying the encounter at the cemetery over and over. He was at his desk by 6, drinking his 3rd cup of black coffee, when Gerald finally called. "Sir, I have something," Gerald said. "The name Lila didn't appear in any of our scholarship databases, but I did find something else. I was reviewing staff records like you asked, and I came across an old photo from one of the company holiday parties. And?" Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Your housekeeper, Amara Williams. She has a daughter named Lila. She's 9 years old." The coffee cup nearly slipped from Richard's hand. Amara. His maid. She had worked for him for over a decade, quiet and efficient, always in the background. He barely knew anything about her personal life. He hadn't even known she had a daughter. "Send me that photo," Richard said, his voice tight. A moment later, his phone buzzed with an email. He opened the attachment and felt his breath catch. There she was. The same girl from the cemetery. Younger in this picture, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She was standing next to Amara at what looked like a staff Christmas party, both of them smiling shyly at the camera. Richard's mind raced with dark possibilities. Was his son secretly involved with Amara? Had there been an affair? Was Lila somehow Daniel's child? The thought made him feel sick, Not because of prejudice, but because it would mean Daniel had hidden such an enormous secret from him. But no, the timeline didn't work. Lila was 9. She would have been 6 when Daniel died. If she had been his daughter, Richard would have known. There would have been legal documents, custody arrangements, something. So what was the connection? Why did this child cry at his son's grave as if she had lost someone she loved? A memory surfaced suddenly, sharp and clear. Daniel had mentioned working with children at the clinic. Richard had dismissed it at the time, too focused on quarterly reports and stock prices to pay attention. But now he remembered fragments of conversations. Daniel talking about a little girl who reminded him of himself as a child. Daniel saying something about art classes and music lessons. Had he been talking about Lila? Richard stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. He needed answers, and he needed them now. But he couldn't just confront Amara directly. She might lie, might protect her daughter from questions she didn't understand. He needed to be careful, strategic. He would wait until evening, catch her at the staff quarters after her shift. He would approach it gently, feel out the situation before pressing too hard. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Richard tried to focus on work, on conference calls and contract negotiations, but his mind kept drifting back to that cemetery, to Lila's tears, to the note that sat folded in his pocket. Finally, as the sun began to set, he made his way to the staff building behind the main house. It was a modest 2-story structure where his household employees lived. Amara had a small apartment on the 2nd floor. Richard climbed the stairs, his heart beating harder than it should have been. He told himself he was being ridiculous, that there was probably a simple explanation for everything. But deep down, he knew he was about to uncover something that would change everything. He reached Amara's door and raised his hand to knock. Then he heard voices inside. He froze, listening. "Mama, I'm sorry." That was Lila's voice, tearful and small. "Baby, I told you not to go there anymore." Amara's voice was strained, worried. "If Mr. Montgomery finds out, but I miss him, Mama. I miss Daniel so much." There was a long pause. Then Amara spoke again, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I know, baby. I know you do. But we have to be careful. He can never find out the truth. Do you understand? Never." Richard felt his blood turn to ice. His hand remained suspended in midair, inches from the door. What truth? What were they hiding? Before he could decide what to do, he heard footsteps approaching the door from inside. He quickly stepped back into the shadows of the stairwell, pressing himself against the wall. The door opened, and Amara stepped out into the hallway. She had her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. She promised she wouldn't go there again. Amara said into the phone, "He must never find out. Do you understand? It would destroy everything." Richard's heart hammered in his chest as he watched her disappear down the hallway. His mind spun with questions, with fears, with a growing sense that his son's death was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Richard had spent another sleepless night, his mind churning with possibilities, each one darker than the last. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to confront Amara directly, needed to hear the truth from her own lips, whatever that truth might be. He found her in the main house, dusting the library shelves as she did every Tuesday morning. She moved with practiced efficiency, her movements quiet and careful. She hadn't noticed him standing in the doorway. "Amara," he said, keeping his voice neutral. She jumped slightly, turning to face him. "Mr. Montgomery, I didn't hear you come in. Can I get you something? Coffee?" "No, thank you." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I wanted to ask you something. Where is your daughter this morning?" He watched her face carefully. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Caution, fear. "She's at school, sir," Amara replied, her voice measured. "Is there a reason you're asking?" Richard decided to test the waters. "I was at the cemetery yesterday, at my son's grave." Amara's hand tightened on the dusting cloth. "I see. I saw a young girl there. She was crying at Daniel's headstone." The cloth slipped from Amara's fingers and fell to the floor. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Amara bent down slowly to pick it up, her hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I can explain," she started. "You will," Richard interrupted, his voice hardening despite his intention to stay calm. "You'll explain how your daughter knows my son well enough to cry at his grave. You'll explain what she meant when she said he saved her. And you'll explain what truth you're so desperate to keep from me." Amara's face went pale. She looked toward the door as if considering running, then seemed to think better of it. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Lila met your son at a hospital charity event 3 years ago. She was sick, very sick. And Daniel, he was kind to her. That's all it was, Mr. Montgomery. Just kindness. That's not all," Richard said, pulling the note from his pocket and holding it up. "She wrote this. She said he saved her." What did she mean by that? Tears welled up in Amara's eyes. "Please, sir, she's just a child. She didn't understand." "Didn't understand what?" Richard's voice rose despite himself. "What am I missing here, Amara? What aren't you telling me?" But Amara just shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "I can't. I promised him. I promised Daniel." The mention of his son's name, spoken with such familiarity, such grief, made Richard's anger falter. He had never seen Amara show this much emotion. In all the years she had worked for him, she had been a quiet presence, invisible almost, the way good help was supposed to be. He had never really thought of her as a person with her own pain, her own losses. "Please leave," Richard said quietly. "We'll finish this conversation later." Amara fled the room without another word, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and a growing sense that he was only seeing the very edge of something much larger and darker. Over the next 2 days, Richard became a man obsessed. He dug through Daniel's old files, his personal belongings that Richard had boxed up, but never had the heart to sort through. He found Daniel's laptop and spent hours clicking through folders, searching for anything related to Lila or Amara. What he found surprised him. Daniel had kept meticulous records of his charity work. There were spreadsheets listing dozens of children's names, their medical conditions, treatment costs, and what assistance had been provided. Richard scrolled through the list, his chest tightening as he realized just how many lives his son had touched. Then he found Lila's name, Lila Williams, age 6 at the time of entry. Diagnosis: severe asthma complicated by pneumonia. Treatment cost: $8,000 for hospitalization and medication. Status: paid in full by D. Montgomery. There was a note attached. "Sweet kid. Reminds me of the world we should be building instead of the one we have. Mom works hard, deserves a break." Richard sat back in his chair, feeling something crack open inside his chest. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't an affair or a secret child. This was just Daniel being Daniel. Seeing someone who needed help and helping them without hesitation, without expectation of recognition or reward. But why the secrecy? Why Amara's fear? He decided to visit the clinic where Daniel had worked. Maybe someone there could give him more context, help him understand why a simple act of charity had become something people were afraid to talk about. The clinic was in a rundown part of town, tucked between a laundromat and a boarded-up convenience store. The building itself looked like it might collapse in a strong wind, its paint peeling and windows cracked. Richard felt deeply uncomfortable as he parked his Mercedes on the street, aware of how out of place he looked in his tailored suit. Inside, The clinic was crowded with people waiting to be seen. The air smelled of disinfectant and something else, something that reminded Richard of poverty and desperation. A harried receptionist barely glanced up as he approached. "I'm looking for someone who worked with Daniel Montgomery," Richard said. "He was a doctor here about 3 years ago." The receptionist's expression softened slightly. "Dr. Danny? Oh, he was wonderful. Hang on, let me get Nurse Patterson. She worked with him." A few minutes later, an elderly black woman with kind eyes and gray hair emerged from a back room. She looked at Richard curiously. "You're asking about Dr. Danny?" "Yes, I'm his father." Her eyes widened. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry for your loss. He was one of the best people I ever worked with." "Thank you," Richard said. "I was hoping you might remember a patient of his. A young girl named Lila Williams." Nurse Patterson's face lit up with recognition. "Lila. Of course I remember her. Such a sweet little thing. She used to come here with her mama. Dr. Danny took a real shine to her. Can you tell me more about their relationship?" The nurse gestured for him to follow her to a small break room. She poured 2 cups of weak coffee and sat down, her movements slow with age. "Lila came in really sick one night," she began. "Couldn't breathe right, scared out of her mind. Her mama was crying because she didn't have insurance, didn't have money for the emergency room. Dr. Danny, he just scooped that little girl right up and took care of everything himself. Paid for her hospital stay, made sure she got the medicine she needed." "That sounds like Daniel," Richard said quietly. "But it didn't stop there," Nurse Patterson continued. "He kept checking on her, making sure she was doing okay. And he saw something special in her, I think. She loved to draw, and he found out she was real talented. Started talking about art classes, maybe even music lessons. He wanted to give her chances she wouldn't otherwise have." The nurse stood up and walked to a bulletin board on the wall. She unpinned an old photograph and handed it to Richard. His breath caught. It was Daniel, younger and smiling, crouched down next to a small Lila at what looked like a playground. They were both covered in paint, laughing at something off camera. The date stamp in the corner read 2 months before Daniel's accident. "He brought her here sometimes on weekends," Nurse Patterson said softly. "We had a little playground out back, nothing fancy. He'd play with her, talk to her about staying in school, dreaming big. She worshipped him. After he died," she trailed off, shaking her head. "That child was heartbroken. Her mama brought her to the funeral, and Lila just sobbed and sobbed." Richard stared at the photograph, his vision blurring. He had been so focused on his own grief after Daniel's death that he hadn't thought about all the other people who had lost him too. All the patients who had depended on him, the children who had looked up to him, the lives he had touched in ways Richard had never understood. "Can I keep this?" he asked, his voice rough. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. I think Dr. Danny would have wanted you to have it." Richard left the clinic in a daze, the photograph clutched in his hand. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at his son's smiling face. He remembered all the arguments they'd had, all the times he had criticized Daniel for being too soft, too giving, too naive about how the world really worked. He had been so wrong, so completely, terribly wrong. That evening, he returned home to find his mansion feeling emptier than ever. He poured himself a whiskey and sat in the study, the photograph propped up on his desk. He thought about confronting Amara again, demanding answers about what she was hiding. But a part of him was afraid of what those answers might be. His phone buzzed with a message from Gerald. "Sir, you asked me to inform you of anything unusual. One of the security cameras caught someone leaving something in the mailbox tonight after hours. Thought you should know." Richard frowned and walked to the front entrance. Sure enough, there was an envelope in the mailbox, plain and unmarked. No postage, no return address. His name was written on it in block letters. He took it back to his study and opened it carefully. Inside was another photograph, this one more recent than the one from the clinic. It showed Daniel and Amara standing together outside what looked like the same clinic. They were both smiling, engaged in conversation. Daniel had his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that looked friendly, familiar. Richard flipped the photo over. On the back, written in the same block letters, were 4 words that made his blood run cold. He died protecting the truth. Richard's hands shook as he stared at the message. Protecting the truth. What truth? And from whom? For the first time, a new and terrible thought entered his mind. What if Daniel's death hadn't been an accident at all? He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Detective Marcus Blake, an old friend from his early business days, someone he trusted. "Richard?" Marcus answered, surprised. "It's been a while." "Marcus, I need your help. I need you to look into my son's accident. Quietly." There was a pause. "Richard, that case was closed years ago. Clean accident, drunk driver fled the scene." "I know what the official report says, but I'm starting to think there's more to it. Can you pull the file? Look at it again with fresh eyes." Another pause, longer this time. "You have new evidence?" Richard looked at the photograph and the message. "Maybe. I'm not sure yet. But something isn't right, Marcus. I can feel it." "All right. Give me a few days. I'll see what I can find." After hanging up, Richard sat in the darkness of his study, surrounded by photographs and questions. He thought about Lila's tears at the cemetery, Amara's fear, the mysterious photograph left in his mailbox. All the pieces were there, scattered before him, but he couldn't yet see how they fit together. He only knew one thing for certain. His son's story wasn't over, and neither was his own search for the truth. Outside, rain began to fall again, tapping against the windows like fingers trying to get in, like the past refusing to stay buried. Richard barely slept after receiving that mysterious photograph. The message replayed in his mind like a broken record. He died protecting the truth. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face, heard his son's voice from their last argument, felt the weight of all those wasted years when pride had stood between them. By morning, exhaustion had carved deep shadows under Richard's eyes, but his resolve had only strengthened. He sat at his desk with Daniel's accident file spread before him. Detective Marcus Blake had dropped it off before dawn, along with a grim warning. "Richard, I looked through this again like you asked," Marcus had said, standing in the doorway with his coat still dripping rain. "The official story holds up on paper. Drunk driver, hit and run. Car found abandoned 2 days later. But there's something that bothered me then and still bothers me now." "What?" Richard had asked, leaning forward. "The driver they pinned it on, Tommy Garrett. He was a known alcoholic, sure. But his blood alcohol that night was barely over the limit. Not nearly enough to explain the aggressive driving witnesses described. And here's the thing." Marcus had pointed to a detail in the report. "The car that hit Daniel? It was reported stolen 2 hours before the accident. Convenient timing." Now, alone in his study, Richard examined that detail more closely. The vehicle had been registered to a small fleet company. He traced the name through his business database and felt his stomach drop. The company was a subcontractor for Montgomery Industries, providing transportation services for one of their manufacturing plants. The same plant Daniel had been investigating. Richard's hands trembled as he pulled up more files. 3 months before his death, Daniel had sent Richard an email marked urgent. Richard had been in Tokyo on business and had deleted it without reading, assuming it was another plea for charitable donations. Now, digging through his archived emails, he found it. The subject line read, "We need to talk about the Riverside facility." Richard opened the email. Daniel's words were careful, but clear. He had been treating patients from the neighborhood surrounding Montgomery Industries' largest factory. Unusual numbers of respiratory problems, skin conditions, developmental issues in children. Daniel suspected contamination and wanted Richard to authorize an environmental status audit. Richard remembered now. He had forwarded the email to his COO, Harlan Pierce, telling him to handle it. Harlan had assured him everything was fine, that Daniel was overreacting, seeing patterns where none existed. Richard had believed him. He had wanted to believe him. "God forgive me," Richard whispered to the empty room. He grabbed his coat and keys. He needed to confront Amara now, needed to know what Daniel had told her, what evidence he might have shared. If Daniel had been killed to protect a secret, Amara might be in danger too. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The moment she saw his face, she knew. "Mr. Montgomery, please," she began, but he cut her off. "Daniel was investigating my company," Richard said, his voice raw. "He found something, didn't he? Something worth killing for." Amara's face crumpled. She glanced toward the doorway, checking if anyone else was nearby, then lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "He came to me 6 weeks before he died. He was scared, Mr. Montgomery. Really scared. He'd found dumping records, chemical reports that didn't match what your company was reporting to. The EPA. The factory near my neighborhood was poisoning the water, the soil, everything." Richard felt the room spin. "Why didn't he come to me?" "He tried," Amara said, tears streaming down her face now. "That email wasn't the first one, but someone was blocking him, keeping the information from reaching you. He didn't know who to trust inside the company anymore. So he came to you. I was helping him gather testimonies from sick families in the neighborhood. We were going to go to the news, to federal regulators. He had a meeting scheduled with the EPA for the Monday after his accident." Amara's voice broke. "It was supposed to be that Monday. Instead, we buried him." Richard sank into a chair, his legs unable to support him anymore. "Where's the evidence? The files he collected?" "I don't know. He said he'd hidden them somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look, but he died before he could tell me where." A thought struck Richard with the force of a physical blow. The night of the accident. Where was Daniel going? Amara's eyes widened as understanding dawned. He was driving Lila home from the clinic. She'd had an asthma attack that evening, and I was working late here. He offered to bring her back to my apartment. Lila was in the car. Richard's voice came out strangled. She was in the back seat when they were hit. Daniel managed to pull her out before the car caught fire. He pushed her away, told her to run, to get help. Then, Amara couldn't continue, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Richard felt something inside him shatter completely. His son hadn't just died protecting the truth. He had died protecting Lila. And Richard had been so consumed by his own grief that he had never thought to ask who else had been there that night, who else had witnessed his son's final moments. "I need to talk to her," Richard said, standing up. "I need to hear what she saw." "No," Amara said firmly, wiping her tears. "She's been through enough. She has nightmares almost every night. She feels guilty, like she should have been able to save him. I won't put her through that again. Amara, please, if she saw something, anything that might help." "Help what? Get justice?" "Mr. Montgomery, with respect, you didn't care about justice when your son was alive and begging you to listen. Why should I trust you now?" The words hit like a slap, all the more painful, because they were true. Richard had no answer for her. He simply nodded and left, his heart heavier than it had been when he arrived. But he couldn't let this go. He wouldn't. If his company had killed his son, he would burn it to the ground himself if he had to. He spent the next 2 days digging deeper. He hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen to track Amara and Lila discreetly, not to harm them, but to ensure their safety. He reviewed 3 years of company financial records looking for irregularities. He found them everywhere. Payments to shell companies, unexplained bonuses, to Harlan Pierce. Sealed settlements with families who had sued over health issues. The pattern was damning. Harlan had been covering up the environmental damage for years, probably skimming money in the process. And when Daniel had threatened to expose it all, Harlan had taken steps to silence him. Richard was examining a particularly suspicious payment record when his phone rang. It was Sarah, the investigator. "Mr. Montgomery, we have a problem. The subjects left their residence early this morning with packed bags. They took a bus heading north. I think they ran." Richard's blood went cold. "Why would they run now?" "I don't know, sir, but I did some checking. That bus route terminates in a small coastal town called Harborview. Does that mean anything to you?" Harborview. Richard searched his memory and then remembered. Daniel had mentioned that town once, said he'd rented a storage unit there for some personal items. At the time, Richard had thought it strange. Daniel lived in the city. Why have storage an hour away, unless he was hiding something he didn't want anyone to find? "Thank you, Sarah. Keep monitoring, but keep your distance. I don't want them feeling threatened." Richard didn't hesitate. He grabbed his car keys and headed north, his mind racing. If Daniel had hidden the evidence in Harborview and Amara was going there now, it meant she had finally decided to retrieve it. But why now? What had changed? The drive took nearly 2 hours through winding coastal roads. Richard's Mercedes felt obscenely luxurious against the backdrop of small fishing villages and weathered houses. He had spent his whole life building an empire, surrounding himself with wealth and power. And somehow he had lost sight of what any of it was actually for. Daniel had understood. Daniel had seen what really mattered. And Richard had been too blind and too proud to listen. He found Amara and Lila at a small elementary school on the edge of town. They were in the office, and through the window he could see a teacher handing Amara something. A sketchbook, it looked like. Richard waited outside until they emerged. When Amara saw him, she gasped and pulled Lila close. "How did you find us?" she asked, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "I hired someone to make sure you were safe," Richard said, holding up his hands. "Please, Amara, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because I know Daniel hid evidence about the company, and I think it's here in this town. I want to help you expose it." "Why should we trust you?" Amara demanded. "Because I finally understand that my son died for something that mattered, and I won't let his death mean nothing." Before Amara could respond, Lila stepped forward. She was holding the sketchbook the teacher had given her. She opened it to a page and held it up for Richard to see. The drawing made his heart stop. It showed a black SUV with distinctive markings following a smaller car. The detail was remarkable for a child's drawing, and in the corner, barely visible, was a license plate number. "I drew it the day after," Lila said quietly. "The car that hit us. I remembered because it had been following us for a while before the crash. I thought maybe it was important." Richard took the sketchbook with shaking hands. The license plate was clear enough to trace. This was evidence. This was proof that the accident had been deliberate. "Lila," he said, kneeling down to her eye level, "you are the bravest person I've ever met. Thank you." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "I should have told someone sooner, maybe if I had." "No," Richard said firmly. "This isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. Do you understand?" Lila nodded, wiping her eyes. Richard stood and looked at Amara. "Please, let me help you finish what Daniel started." Amara studied his face for a long moment, then finally nodded. "The storage unit is 2 blocks from here." They walked together through the small town, past fishing boats and seafood restaurants. The storage facility was at the end of a quiet street. Amara pulled out a key that Richard recognized as one that used to hang in Danielle's old room. Inside Unit 17, they found boxes of documents, medical records with names redacted for privacy, water test results, soil samples, internal company memos discussing the pollution and decisions to hide it. and a flash drive labeled simply, "For Dad." Richard's hands trembled as he picked it up. He hadn't brought a laptop, but there was an internet cafe down the street. They went there, ordered coffee they didn't drink, and Richard plugged in the flash drive. A video file opened. Daniel's face appeared on screen, and Richard felt his breath catch. It had been 3 years since he'd seen his son alive, heard his voice. "Dad," Daniel said on the video, "if you're watching this, it means something happened to me. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm being paranoid. But if I'm not, you need to know the truth." Daniel went on to explain everything. The contamination, the cover-up, Harlan's role in blocking his reports. He detailed how he'd collected evidence, how he'd planned to expose it all. "I know you built this company from nothing," Daniel said, his eyes sad but determined. "I know how much it means to you. But Dad, it's become something corrupt. Something that hurts people, and I can't stand by and watch that happen. I hope you'll understand. I hope you'll do the right thing." The video ended. Richard sat staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down his face. Lila, sitting beside him, reached out and took his hand. "He loved you," she said simply. "He told me once. He said his dad was the strongest man he knew, and someday you'd be a hero." Richard couldn't speak. He could only hold this child's hand and let the tears fall. They left the cafe and walked back toward the storage unit to gather the evidence. Amara was ahead, carrying one of the boxes. Lila walked beside Richard, still holding the sketchbook. That's when Richard saw it. A black SUV parked at the end of the street. The same distinctive markings from Lila's drawing. "Amara!" he shouted. "Get Lila and run!" But it was too late. The SUV's doors opened, and 2 men stepped out. They were big, wearing dark suits that did nothing to disguise the weapons bulging under their jackets. "Mr. Montgomery," one of them called out, "Mr. Pierce would like that flash drive back, and all the other evidence you've collected." Richard stepped in front of Amara and Lila, his heart pounding. "You work for Harlan. We work for people who want this problem to go away, just like your son was a problem that went away." Rage flooded through Richard, hot and consuming. "You killed my son." "That wasn't personal, just business. Now hand over the drive or we'll make this personal." Richard's mind raced. They were in the middle of a small town in broad daylight. There had to be witnesses, people who could help. But the street was strangely empty, and the cafe they'd just left had its windows covered with newspapers. This had been planned. Harlan knew they were here. He'd been tracking them somehow. "The drive's in my pocket," Richard said slowly. "I'll give it to you. Just let them go." "Nice try. We'll take the drive and make sure all 3 of you understand the importance of silence." Richard knew what that meant. They weren't walking away from this. Amara pulled Lila close, shielding her daughter with her body. Lila was crying silently, her face pressed against her mother's side. Richard thought of Daniel, of his son's courage in standing up to corruption, even when it cost him everything. Daniel had died protecting Lila. Now it was Richard's turn to protect them both. He reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out the flash drive, he pulled out his phone and threw it hard at the nearest man's face. The man flinched and Richard shouted, "Run!" Amara grabbed Lila and sprinted toward a gap between buildings. Richard tried to follow, but one of the men tackled him to the ground. His head hit the pavement hard and stars exploded across his vision. "You stupid old man," the man growled, pressing a knee into Richard's back. Through the ringing in his ears, Richard heard Amara screaming. He lifted his head and saw the second man had caught her, had grabbed Lila by the arm. "No," Richard shouted, struggling against the weight holding him down. Then, miraculously, a siren wailed in the distance. The man on top of Richard cursed and looked toward the sound. Police cars were racing down the street, 3 of them, lights flashing. "We need to go." the second man said, releasing Lila and running for the SUV. Richard's captor hesitated, then got up and ran as well. The SUV peeled away just as the police cars arrived. Detective Marcus Blake stepped out of the first car, gun drawn. He rushed over to Richard, helping him sit up. "Are you all right?" Marcus asked. Richard nodded, though his head was spinning. "How did you know?" "I've been tracking Pierce's phone records. When calls started going to some very unsavory characters and those calls pinged near this location, I figured you might need backup." Marcus looked at Amara and Lila, who were being checked by other officers. "Looks like I was right." Richard struggled to his feet with Marcus's help. His body ached, but relief flooded through him. They were safe. Lila was safe. He walked over to where Amara sat on the curb. Lila clutched in her arms. Both were shaking, but unharmed. "It's over," Richard said, kneeling beside them. "I promise you, it's over. We have the evidence. We have witnesses now. Pierce and everyone involved will pay for what they did to Daniel." Amara looked at him with exhausted eyes. "I just want my daughter safe. She will be. You both will be. I'll make sure of it." Later, in the small police station, Richard gave his full statement. He handed over the flash drive, the documents, everything. Marcus coordinated with federal environmental officers and prosecutors from the state attorney's office. By evening, warrants were being prepared. Richard sat in the station's small waiting room with Amara and Lila. The girl had finally stopped crying, and now sat between them, her head resting on Richard's shoulder. It felt surreal, this connection with a child he'd barely known existed a week ago. "What happens now?" Amara asked quietly. "Now we make sure Daniel's sacrifice means something," Richard said. "We expose the truth. We clean up the contamination. We help the families who were hurt, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "And us?" Amara gestured to herself and Lila. "You'll be protected. I'll hire security, the best money can buy. And when this is all over, if you want to leave, I'll help you start over anywhere you want, but I hope you'll stay." He looked down at Lila. "I owe this brave girl and her mother more than I could ever repay." Lila lifted her head and looked at him with those deep brown eyes that had been haunting him since the cemetery. "Daniel said you were a good person who just forgot how to see it. He said someday you'd remember." Richard's throat tightened. "Your mother said Daniel told you his dad would be a hero someday. I'm not there yet, but I'm going to try." "Trying is the important part," Lila said with a wisdom beyond her years. "That's what Daniel always told me." Night had fallen by the time they left the station. Marcus had arranged for them to stay at a small inn in town under police protection until it was safe to return home. As they walked to the car, Richard looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. Daniel had loved stargazing. When he was young, before the arguments and the distance between them had grown too wide, they used to lie on the grass in summer and pick out constellations. "I see you, son," Richard whispered to the darkness. "I finally see you." In his pocket, the flash drive felt like it, weighed 1,000 pounds. It held the truth that had cost Daniel his life, but it also held the key to honoring that life, to making sure Daniel's dream of a better world wasn't buried with him. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Tomorrow, Richard would start dismantling the corrupt empire he'd built, piece by piece if necessary. But tonight, he sat with Amara and Lila in the small inn sitting room, sharing hot chocolate and starting to heal the wounds that ran deeper than any of them had realized. Lila showed him more of her drawings, and for the first time since Daniel's death, Richard felt something other than grief and guilt. He felt purpose. He felt hope. And he felt his son's presence, not as a ghost haunting him, but as a light, guiding him forward. The morning after the confrontation in Harborview, Richard stood on the small inn's porch watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. His body ached from being slammed to the pavement, and a dark bruise had formed along his left temple. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight of what lay ahead. Behind him, through the window, he could see Amara making breakfast in the tiny kitchenette, while Lila sat at the table, coloring in a new sketchbook one of the officers had brought her. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that it felt almost unreal given what they'd been through. Marcus arrived just after 8, looking tired but energized. He carried a folder thick with documents and wore an expression that Richard had learned meant news, both good and bad. "Pierce is still in the wind," Marcus said without preamble, settling into one of the porch chairs. "But we've frozen his accounts and issued warrants. He can't hide forever." "What about the others? The men who attacked us?" "One of them got pulled over for speeding about 50 miles from here. Had a weapon in the car, no permit. He's talking, trying to cut a deal. Names, phone records, payment receipts. It's all coming together, Richard." Richard exhaled slowly. "How long before we can go public?" "The prosecutors want to move fast before Pierce can destroy more evidence. They're suggesting a press conference tomorrow. Are you ready for that?" Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours to prepare for the moment that would define the rest of his life. Richard thought about his company, his reputation, everything he'd spent decades building. Then he thought about Daniel's face on that video, full of hope that his father would do the right thing. "Yes," Richard said firmly, "I'm ready." They returned to the city that afternoon in a convoy of police vehicles. Marcus had arranged for round-the-clock protection at Richard's estate. Armed officers would be stationed outside, and a security team would sweep the property daily. It seemed excessive until Richard remembered the look in those men's eyes yesterday, the casual way they'd threatened to kill them all. Lila had been quiet during the drive, pressed against, her mother's side in the back seat. Richard watched them in the rearview mirror, noting how Amara kept stroking her daughter's hair, whispering reassurances that Richard couldn't quite hear. When they arrived at the mansion, Lila's eyes went wide. She'd never been inside the main house before, only the staff quarters where she sometimes visited her mother after school. "It's like a castle," she whispered. "It's too big," Richard said honestly. "Too empty. I never realized how empty until recently." He showed them to guest rooms on the second floor, spacious suites with attached bathrooms and views of the garden. Amara looked uncomfortable accepting such accommodations, but Richard insisted. "You're not staff anymore," he said gently. "You're family. Or at least, I hope someday you'll think of it that way." That evening, as Amara put Lila to bed, Richard sat in his study preparing his statement for the press conference. He'd written and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find words adequate for what he needed to say. "How did you confess to the world that your success was built on poisoning children? How did you admit that your son had died trying to stop you from doing harm?" There was a soft knock on the door. Lila peeked in, wearing pajamas covered in stars. "I can't sleep," she said. "Can I come in?" "Of course." She patted across the carpet and climbed into the leather chair across from his desk, tucking her feet under her. For a moment, she just looked around the room, taking in the walls of books and the paintings of stern-faced Montgomery ancestors. "Are you scared?" she asked suddenly. Richard considered lying, giving her the brave face adults so often showed children. But Lila had been through too much to be treated like she couldn't handle truth. "Yes," he admitted. "I'm terrified. Tomorrow I'm going to tell everyone about the terrible things my company did. A lot of people will be very angry with me. But you're doing it anyway." "Yes." "That's what brave is," Lila said matter-of-factly. "Daniel told me that once. He said being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you're shaking." Richard felt his eyes sting with tears. He was a smart man, wasn't he? The smartest, Lila agreed. Then she reached into her pajama pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I made you something, for tomorrow. She handed it to him, and Richard carefully unfolded it. It was a drawing, done in crayon, but with surprising detail. It showed a man standing at a podium with crowds of people in front of him. Above the man's head, she'd drawn an angel with Daniel's face, his hand resting on the man's shoulder. At the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Truth wins." Richard's hands trembled as he held the picture. "Lila, this is beautiful. Can I keep it?" She nodded. "Daniel's watching. He'll help you be brave." After she went back to bed, Richard tucked the drawing into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, when he stood before those cameras and faced the consequences of decades of corporate greed, he would carry this reminder of why it mattered. Not for redemption, though he desperately wanted that. Not even for justice, though that was important. But for all the Lilas of the world who deserved to grow up in neighborhoods that didn't poison them. Sleep came fitfully that night. Richard woke repeatedly from dreams of Daniel, of accusations and forgiveness tangled together in ways he couldn't separate. When dawn finally broke, he felt exhausted, but strangely calm. The press conference was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Montgomery Industries headquarters. News vans had been gathering since sunrise, journalists sensing a major story. Richard's assistant Gerald had fielded hundreds of calls, the media frenzy building with each passing hour. Rumors were already swirling about environmental violations and federal investigations. Richard dressed carefully in his best suit, the same one he'd worn when he'd given the keynote speech at the National Business Summit 2 years ago. Back then, he'd been praised as a captain of industry, a success story of American capitalism. Today, he would dismantle that image piece by piece. Before leaving, he stopped by the breakfast room where Amara and Lila were eating. Lila jumped up and ran to him. "Remember," she said, pressing her small hand against his chest. "Daniel's with you." Richard knelt and hugged her tight. "Thank you, sweetheart, for everything." The drive to Montgomery Tower felt both too long and too short. Marcus rode with him in the back of an armored sedan, 2 police cars in front and behind. The security was necessary, Marcus had insisted. Pierce was still out there, and desperate men did unpredictable things. As they pulled up to the building, Richard saw the massive crowd gathered on the plaza. Reporters with cameras, protesters with signs, employees looking confused and worried. His entire world converging on this single moment. Gerald met him at a side entrance, looking pale and shaken. "Sir, the board members are demanding to speak with you before the conference. They're threatening legal action if you—" "Let them threaten," Richard said calmly. "Is everything ready?" "Yes, sir. The podium is set up, the microphones are working, the evidence documents have been distributed to major news outlets. But, sir, are you absolutely certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." They made their way to the main floor where the press conference was being held. Richard could hear the murmur of the crowd growing louder. His heart pounded hard enough that he wondered if others could hear it. Marcus touched his arm. "You don't have to do this alone. I can stand with you up there." "Thank you, but yes, I do. This is my company, my responsibility. I need to face it myself." He walked through the doors into the conference hall. Camera flashes exploded like lightning. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, some curious, some hostile, some simply waiting to see a powerful man fall. Richard stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the sea of people. He reached into his pocket and felt Lila's drawing, the paper soft under his fingers. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "My name is Richard Montgomery, and I'm the founder and CEO of Montgomery Industries. I'm here today to tell you about crimes my company has committed, crimes I was either ignorant of or chose to ignore. I'm here to tell you about my son Daniel, who died trying to expose these crimes, and I'm here to tell you that everything ends today." He had prepared a longer opening, something more polished, but those simple words felt right, honest, real. 3 years ago, my son was killed in what appeared to be a car accident. I mourned him, but I never questioned the circumstances of his death. That was my first mistake. My second was not listening to him while he was alive. Richard went on, laying out everything: the illegal dumping at the Riverside facility, the falsified environmental reports, the bribes paid to inspectors, the families who had gotten sick, the children who had developed chronic illnesses. He named Harlan Pierce as the primary architect of the cover-up and detailed the evidence linking Pierce to Daniel's murder. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Some reporters were typing frantically. Others just stared, mouths open in shock. My son Daniel believed in honesty more than profit. Richard continued, his voice strengthening. Today, I intend to honor him by... The lights went out. Gasps and shouts erupted from the crowd. Emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Richard's security team immediately surrounded him, pulling him back from the podium. "What's happening?" Richard demanded. Marcus was already on his radio. "We've got a fire in the server room, 3rd floor. It's spreading fast." Fire alarms began wailing throughout the building. Sprinkler systems activated, raining water down on the panicking crowd. Through the chaos, Richard saw smoke beginning to billow from the hallway. "This is sabotage," Marcus shouted over the noise. "We need to evacuate now." But Richard's mind was racing. The server room. That's where all the company's digital records were stored. Backups, files, everything that corroborated the evidence Daniel had collected. Someone was trying to destroy it all. "Where's the flash drive?" he yelled to Marcus. "The one from Harbor View?" "Should be in the secure evidence locker." "Why?" "Because if the building's servers are destroyed, that drive might be the only complete copy of everything." Understanding flashed across Marcus's face. He spoke rapidly into his radio, coordinating with his team. Meanwhile, security was herding people toward the exits. The smoke was getting thicker, the heat more intense. Through the chaos, Richard saw a figure moving against the flow of the crowd, someone heading deeper into the building instead of out. He caught a glimpse of a face in the emergency lighting. Amara. His heart seized with terror. What was she doing here? She was supposed to be at the estate with Lila, safe behind guards and gates. "Amara!" he shouted, but his voice was lost in the noise. He broke away from his security detail and ran after her, ignoring their shouts of protest. The smoke was thick now, burning his lungs and making his eyes water. He pulled his jacket up to cover his nose and mouth. He found her on the 3rd floor stairwell, struggling with a fire extinguisher. Through the smoke, he could see why. The server room door was engulfed in flames, but Amara was trying desperately to fight through. "What are you doing?" Richard yelled, grabbing her arm. "We have to get out." "The drive," she screamed back. "I brought it with me. I thought it would be safer here than at your house, so I gave it to your assistant this morning. He said he'd put it in your office safe." Richard felt the ground drop out from under him. The office was on this floor, just past the burning server room. If the fire reached it before they could retrieve the drive, everything Daniel had died for would be lost. "Stay here," he ordered Amara. "I'm going in." "Are you insane? You'll die." "Then Daniel's death means nothing." Richard grabbed the fire extinguisher from her and sprayed a path through the flames. The heat was incredible, like walking into an oven. He could barely see through the smoke, could barely breathe. He made it past the server room and stumbled toward his office. The door was locked. He kicked it once, twice, feeling something in his knee give way. The third kick splintered the door frame. Inside, the smoke was less dense, but the temperature was still suffocating. He lurched to his desk, pulled open the drawer where he kept the safe key, and fumbled it into the lock. His hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries. The safe opened. Inside was the flash drive, sitting exactly where Gerald must have placed it that morning. Richard grabbed it and turned to leave. That's when he saw the figure standing in the doorway, silhouetted by flames. Harlan Pierce. "Did you really think I'd let you destroy everything we built?" Pierce said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. He was disheveled, wild-eyed, holding something in his hand that caught the flickering light. A knife. "It's over, Harlan," Richard said, clutching the drive. "The evidence is already out there. Killing me won't change that. Maybe not, but it'll make me feel a hell of a lot better." Pierce lunged forward. Richard tried to dodge, but his injured knee buckled. He fell hard, the flash drive skittering across the floor. Pierce grabbed for it, and Richard grabbed for Pierce, and suddenly they were struggling on the ground while fire raged around them. Richard was older, hurt, exhausted. Pierce was younger, stronger, and fueled by desperate rage. The knife slashed down, and Richard barely caught Pierce's wrist, holding the blade inches from his throat. "You killed my son," Richard gasped out, every muscle straining. "Your son was going to ruin everything. All our work, all our success. Success built on poisoned children, on lies." The knife crept closer. Richard's arms were giving out. He thought of Daniel, of Lila, of all the things he should have done differently. He thought about dying here, in this burning building, with his life's work literally going up in flames around him. Then something hard cracked against the back of Pierce's head. The man's eyes rolled back and he collapsed sideways. Behind him stood Amara, holding a heavy bookend from Richard's shelf, her face set with grim determination. "I told you to stay in the stairwell," Richard coughed. "And I told you once before, Mr. Montgomery, that I don't take orders well when my family's in danger." Amara replied, helping him to his feet. "You're family now, so move." They grabbed the flash drive and stumbled toward the door, leaving Pierce unconscious on the floor. Richard had a brief impulse to drag the man out with them, but Amara was already pulling him forward, and the smoke was so thick he could barely think. They made it to the stairwell where Marcus and his team were waiting with oxygen masks and firefighters. Strong hands pulled them down the stairs and out into the blessed fresh air of the plaza. Richard collapsed on the pavement, gasping and coughing. Someone put an oxygen mask over his face. Through watering eyes, he saw fire trucks hosing down Montgomery Tower, saw news cameras capturing everything, saw the flash drive still clutched in his smoke-blackened hand. "Pierce," he managed to say to Marcus. "Third floor. My office." Marcus relayed the information to the fire department. Minutes that felt like hours passed before they carried Pierce out on a stretcher, unconscious but breathing. He was immediately surrounded by police officers, handcuffs ready. An ambulance arrived for Richard and Amara. Paramedics checked them over, bandaging burns and treating smoke inhalation. Richard's knee was swelling badly. He'd probably torn something important, but he barely cared. "Is it safe?" he asked Marcus, holding up the flash drive. "Did we get it out in time?" Marcus took it carefully and plugged it into a laptop one of his officers provided. After a tense moment, he smiled. "It's all here. Every document, every video, every piece of evidence. We got it." Richard closed his eyes, feeling tears of relief mix with the soot on his face. "Thank God." "The press is still here," Marcus said gently. "They filmed everything. The fire, you running in, Pierce attacking you. It's already going viral. Everyone wants to know what happens next." Richard looked at the smoldering building, at his life's work damaged but not destroyed. Then he looked at Amara beside him, at the flash drive, containing his son's legacy. "What happens next," Richard said slowly, "is we finish what we started." An hour later, standing on the plaza with a bandaged hand and ash-stained clothes, Richard faced the cameras again. This time, The press conference wasn't polished or planned. It was raw, real, and witnessed by millions streaming it live. As you can see, someone tried to stop the truth from coming out. Richard said hoarsely. They failed. Montgomery Industries has committed environmental crimes that harmed hundreds of families. My son Daniel died trying to expose these crimes. Today, with the evidence he gathered, we're ensuring his death wasn't in vain. He detailed everything again, this time with the full weight of the morning's events behind his words. The media had already captured footage of Pierce being carried out in handcuffs. They'd filmed Richard's desperate run into the burning building. The narrative was writing itself, and for once, it was a narrative of truth. I'm announcing the immediate dissolution of Montgomery Industries' current leadership structure, Richard continued. I'm stepping down as CEO and appointing an independent administrator to oversee the company's restructuring. All profits for the next 5 years will go toward environmental cleanup and medical care for affected families. This is only the beginning of making things right. The crowd erupted with questions, but Richard held up his hand. There's one more thing. I'd like someone special to say a few words. He gestured to the side of the plaza, where Amara stood with Lila. The little girl had insisted on coming once she'd heard about the fire, terrified that Richard and her mother had been hurt. Now, with her mother's hand in hers, she walked slowly to the podium. Richard lifted her up so she could reach the microphone. Lila looked out at the sea of cameras and people, her small voice somehow carrying across the plaza. "My name is Lila Williams," she said. "I'm 9 years old. 3 years ago, Dr. Daniel Montgomery saved my life. Not just from the car crash, but before that too. He paid for my medicine when my mama couldn't afford it. He was kind when nobody else was." She paused, looking at the drawing she'd brought with her. "Mr. Daniel taught me that everyone deserves to live clean. That means clean air and clean water, not just clean clothes. He died because he believed that. Mr. Richard is trying to believe it too now." She held up her drawing for the cameras, the one showing Daniel as an angel, and the words, "Truth wins," written beneath. "This is for Mr. Daniel," she said simply, "and for all the other kids like me." The plaza fell silent. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Then another, and another, until the sound of applause rolled across the crowd like thunder. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Even hardened journalists wiped at their eyes. Richard lifted Lila down and hugged her tight. "You're braver than any of us," he whispered. "I learned from the best," she whispered back. As the applause continued, as the cameras kept rolling, as his empire crumbled and was reborn into something honest, Richard felt his son's presence more strongly than ever. Not as a ghost, not as guilt, but as a guiding light showing him the path forward. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be lawsuits, investigations, probably criminal charges for some of his executives. His personal fortune would be decimated. His reputation was already destroyed. But standing there with Amara and Lila, with Marcus and his team, with the truth finally exposed to the light, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like Daniel's father again. And this time, he was determined to make his son proud. The days following the press conference blurred together in a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and sleepless nights. Richard's mansion had become a fortress, surrounded by security personnel and news vans that refused to leave. Inside, however, something unexpected was happening. The cavernous rooms that had echoed with loneliness for years were beginning to fill with life. Lila's laughter rang through the hallways as she explored the house, discovering hidden nooks and crannies that Richard himself had forgotten existed. Amara had initially resisted staying, insisting they should return to their small apartment once the immediate danger passed. But Richard had convinced her that Lila's safety was paramount, at least until Pierce's trial was over and his associates were rounded up. The truth was, Richard didn't want them to leave. For the first time since Daniel's death, his house felt like a home. It was a stormy Thursday night, 2 weeks after the fire, when everything nearly fell apart again. Richard sat in Daniel's old study, a room he'd kept locked since his son's death but had finally opened. He was sorting through boxes of Daniel's belongings, discovering letters and journals that revealed a young man even more remarkable than he'd known. The lights flickered, then died completely. Thunder rolled across the sky, and rain lashed against the windows. Richard stood up, his injured knee protesting, and reached for the flashlight he now kept on the desk. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. It didn't. "Mr. Montgomery?" That was Amara's voice, tight with worry, coming from upstairs. "Richard, I'm here," he called back, moving toward the hallway. "Stay with Lila. I'm coming to you." He made his way through the darkness, the beam of his flashlight cutting narrow paths through the shadows. The house felt different without power, older somehow, full of creaking sounds he'd never noticed before. His security team should have already checked in on the radio. Their silence was unnerving. Richard reached the grand staircase and started climbing. That's when he heard it. Footsteps on the floor above, too heavy to be Amara or Lila. His blood turned to ice. "Amara!" he shouted, abandoning caution. "Lock the door!" He took the stairs as fast as his damaged knee would allow, pain shooting up his leg with each step. Behind him, he heard more footsteps. Someone else was in the house, coming up behind him. Richard reached the second-floor hallway just as a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating Harlan Pierce's face for a split second. He was soaked from the rain, wild-eyed, and holding something that gleamed in the darkness. A knife. "You destroyed everything," Pierce hissed, his voice barely controlled. "My career, my reputation, my life. All for what? Your dead son's naive crusade? Harlan, you were arrested," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind raced. "How did you—" "Posted bail 2 hours ago. My lawyers are very good, Richard, unlike your security team, apparently." Pierce took a step forward. "I should have killed you in that office. I won't make that mistake again." Behind Richard, more footsteps pounded up the stairs. He glanced back to see 2 men in dark clothes, both armed. Pierce's associates, the ones who'd attacked them in Harborview. Richard was trapped between them, injured, unarmed, and terrified. But he wasn't the man he'd been 2 weeks ago. That man would have tried to negotiate, to buy his way out of danger. This Richard stood his ground. "Lila!" he shouted toward the guest suite. "Run! Get to the safe room." He'd had it installed 3 days ago, a reinforced panic room accessible through Lila's closet. It was connected directly to the police station's emergency line. Pierce lunged forward. Richard threw his flashlight at the man's face and dove sideways, crashing through the open doorway of Daniel's old bedroom. He scrambled to his feet and slammed the door, locking it. "That won't hold us long, old man," Pierce called from the hallway. "And when we get through, your maid and her brat die first. I'll make you watch." Rage, pure and burning, flooded through Richard. He looked around the room desperately. Daniel's trophies from his medical school days lined one shelf. Richard grabbed a heavy marble award and positioned himself beside the door. The first kick splintered the wood. The second broke the lock. As the door crashed open, Richard swung the trophy with all his strength. It connected with solid flesh, and one of Pierce's thugs went down hard. But the second man was right behind him, and Pierce was shouting orders. Richard tried to fight, tried to protect himself, but he was one injured older man against 2 younger, stronger opponents. A fist caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Another blow to his face sent him sprawling. Through the ringing in his ears, Richard heard Lila screaming. No, they'd gotten to her. They'd gotten to both of them. He tried to get up, but someone's boot pressed down on his back, grinding him into the floor. Pierce knelt beside him, pressing the knife against his throat. "Where's the safe room?" Pierce demanded. "Tell me or I start cutting." Richard tasted blood. His vision was blurring, but he smiled through broken lips. "Go to hell." That's when he heard something beautiful. Sirens. Multiple sirens getting closer. Pierce heard them too, his face contorted with fury. "You triggered an alarm." "My goddaughter is very smart," Richard gasped out. "She got to the safe room. The police were called automatically." Pierce pressed the knife harder, and Richard felt it break skin. "Then you're coming with us. Hostage." Strong hands grabbed Richard and hauled him to his feet. His injured knee buckled, but the thugs held him upright, dragging him toward the stairs. Through the windows, red and blue lights were already visible, police cars pouring through the gates. They made it to the first floor before the front doors burst open. Officers flooded in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Pierce held the knife to Richard's throat, using him as a shield. "Back off," Pierce screamed. "Back off or I kill him right here." The officers froze, their guns trained on Pierce but unable to fire without risking Richard. It was a standoff, tension thick enough to choke on. Then a voice cut through the chaos. Detective Marcus Blake stepping forward with his hands raised. "Harlan, listen to me," Marcus said calmly. "This is over. You're surrounded. Killing Richard won't help you. It'll just add murder to your charges." "I don't care anymore," Pierce shouted. "He took everything from me. Everything." "No," another voice said. This one smaller, younger, but somehow carrying more weight than any of the adults. "You took everything from yourself." Lila emerged from behind the officers, holding her mother's hand. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "You hurt people for money," she continued, looking directly at Pierce. "You killed Mr. Daniel because he was going to tell the truth. Now you want to kill Richard too? That won't fix what you did. It'll just make you worse." Pierce stared at her, the knife trembling in his hand. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or the ghost of the man he'd been before greed had consumed him. The moment was enough. Marcus moved fast, grabbing Pierce's knife hand while another officer tackled him from behind. Richard fell forward, and immediately officers surrounded him, checking his injuries, securing the scene. It was over. Finally. Truly over. Pierce was arrested again, this time with no bail possible. His associates were taken into custody. The security team, who had been drugged with tainted coffee, Pierce had somehow delivered earlier, were treated by paramedics and then fired by Richard for their failure. As medics bandaged the cut on Richard's throat and checked his other injuries, he watched Amara holding Lila tight, both of them crying with relief. He'd almost gotten them killed. His quest for redemption had put them directly in danger. "I'm sorry," he said when they finally approached. "I should have sent you somewhere safe, somewhere far from all this." Amara shook her head. "We chose to stay. We wanted to see this through." "Why?" Richard asked, genuinely confused. "I've brought you nothing but danger and pain." Lila pulled away from her mother and walked over to Richard. She took his bandaged hand gently in both of hers. "Because Daniel asked us to watch over you," she said simply. "In the hospital, right before he died, he made Mom a promise. He said you'd need help remembering who you really are. We're keeping our promise." Richard felt something crack open in his chest, years of grief and guilt finally breaking through. He pulled Lila into a hug and wept openly, no longer caring who saw, no longer trying to maintain the cold facade he'd worn for so long. Marcus gave them a moment, then cleared his throat. "Richard, there's someone here who wants to talk to you." Richard looked up to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was thin, perhaps in her early 30s, holding a small boy by the hand. The child was maybe 5 years old, wearing a breathing mask connected to a portable oxygen tank. "Mr. Montgomery," the woman said nervously, "my name is Jennifer Patterson. I live near your Riverside facility. This is my son, Marcus Jr." Richard struggled to his feet, wiping his eyes. "What can I do for you?" "I saw your press conference. I saw what you said about medical care for affected families." Her voice broke. "My boy has been sick since he was 2. Respiratory problems, constant infections. The doctors say his lungs are damaged, probably from environmental exposure. I've been trying to get help, but I can't afford the treatments he needs." She held out a folder of medical records with shaking hands. "I don't know if you meant what you said, but if you did, if there's any chance you can help my baby." Richard took the folder, his throat tight. Inside were pictures of a healthy toddler gradually becoming sicker, bills for tens of thousands of dollars in medical debt, rejection letters from insurance companies. This was what his company had done. This child's suffering was on his hands. "I meant every word," Richard said hoarsely. "Give your information to Detective Blake. Your son will have the best doctors money can buy, and you won't pay a single dollar. I promise you." Jennifer burst into tears. "Thank you. God bless you. Thank you." As she left with Marcus to process her information, more people began appearing. Word had spread somehow that Richard Montgomery was accessible, that he was actually listening. A mother whose daughter had developmental delays. An elderly man with cancer. A young couple whose baby had been born with birth defects. Richard met with them all, took their information, made promises he intended to keep. By the time the last person left, it was nearly dawn. He was exhausted, in pain, and overwhelmed by the scope of damage his company had caused. But he was also, for the first time in years, certain he was doing exactly what he should be doing. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Richard liquidated personal assets, selling his yacht, his vacation properties, his collection of expensive cars. He kept only the mansion, and that only because Amara and Lila lived there now. The money went toward establishing the medical fund Daniel had dreamed of. Harlan Pierce's trial became a media sensation. Prosecutors brought extensive evidence of corporate fraud, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to commit murder. The testimony from Danielle's video, from Amara, from Lila, and from Richard himself painted a damning picture. On the day of the verdict, Richard sat in the courtroom with Amara on one side and Lila on the other. Across the aisle, Pierce sat in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive lawyers unable to overcome the weight of evidence against him. The jury foreman stood. "On the count of corporate manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On all environmental violation charges, we find the defendant guilty." Pierce's face remained expressionless as the judge sentenced him to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. As officers led him away, he glanced once at Richard. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, just emptiness. Richard felt no satisfaction in the verdict, only a deep sadness for all the lives destroyed by greed, including Pierce's own. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them. Richard made a brief statement thanking the prosecutors and promising continued cooperation in cleaning up the environmental damage. Then Lila tugged on his sleeve. "Can we go to the cemetery?" she asked quietly. "I want to tell Mr. Daniel." They drove to Evergreen Cemetery that afternoon, just the 3 of them. The same cemetery where this whole journey had begun weeks ago. Richard walked the familiar path to Daniel's grave, but this time he wasn't alone. Lila held one hand, Amara the other. Someone had left fresh flowers at the headstone. Richard knelt down, his knee still stiff but healing, and placed his hand on Daniel's engraved name the way Lila had that first day. "We did it, son," he said softly. "Pierce is in prison. The cleanup has started. Families are getting help. It's not enough, It'll never be enough to undo the harm. But it's a start. Lila knelt beside him and pulled out a new drawing. This one showed 3 figures standing together at a grave, and above them, Daniel smiling down. She propped it against the headstone. "I added you to the picture," she told Richard, "because now we're a family. That's okay, right? You don't mind sharing Daniel with us?" Richard pulled her close, his eyes burning with tears. "Sweetheart, I think Daniel would have wanted nothing more." They sat together in the quiet cemetery as the sun began to set. 3 people bound together by loss and love, and a commitment to honor a good man's memory. 6 months later, Richard stood at the edge of what had once been the polluted riverside neighborhood. But it looked different now. The factory had been demolished, the soil remediated, the water cleaned. In its place, construction crews were building something new. The Daniel Montgomery Community Health Center. It would offer free medical care, mental health services, environmental health monitoring, and educational programs. The design had been Amara's idea, with input from neighborhood residents about what they actually needed, not what wealthy donors thought they should have. Beside the construction site, a temporary medical clinic was already operating, treating patients from the area. Richard visited regularly, talking to families, listening to their stories, trying to understand the human cost of his former ignorance. "Mr. Richard," Lila came running across the lot, wearing a hard hat that was comically large on her small head. She'd become the unofficial mascot of the project, her enthusiasm infectious to everyone she met. "Come see, they're putting up the sign." Richard followed her to where workers were installing the center's main sign. The Daniel Montgomery name gleamed in bronze letters, and beneath it, a quote Daniel had once written in his journal: "Healing begins when we choose people over profit." The gathering crowd began to applaud. Richard saw Jennifer Patterson there with Marcus Jr., who no longer needed his oxygen tank after months of treatment. The elderly man with cancer, now in remission. The young couple with their baby, healthy and thriving with proper medical care. Dozens of families whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. Amara came to stand beside him, watching the sign being secured into place. "He would have loved this," she said. "Yes," Richard agreed. "He would have." That evening, they returned to the mansion for a quiet dinner. It had become their tradition, the 3 of them eating together every night, sharing stories about their day. Richard had learned more about Lila in these months than he'd learned about anyone in decades. Her favorite color was purple. She wanted to be a doctor like Daniel when she grew up. She was afraid of spiders, but loved thunderstorms. After dinner, Lila asked if she could show Richard something. She led him to what had once been a formal sitting room, but was now her art studio. The walls were covered with her drawings, a visual timeline of their journey together. "I've been working on something special," she said, pulling a canvas from behind an easel, "for the community center's lobby." The painting showed Daniel in his white coat, surrounded by children of all different backgrounds. His hands were outstretched, welcoming, and his smile was the warm, genuine one Richard remembered from before their relationship had soured. At the bottom, Lila had written, "Dr. Daniel Montgomery, he chose truth over power." Richard stared at it, overwhelmed. "Lila, this is incredible. When did you learn to paint like this?" "Mama signed me up for classes," Lila said proudly, "with the money you gave us for school activities. The teacher says I have real talent." "You have more than talent," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have his heart, Daniel's heart. You see the good in people just like he did." Layla hugged him tight. "That's because good people taught me. Daniel first, then Mama, then you." Later, after Lila had gone to bed, Richard and Amara sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance in the garden. It was a warm summer night, peaceful and calm in a way that felt almost unreal after the chaos of the past months. "I've been thinking," Amara said carefully, "about what happens next. The trial is over, the foundation is established, the cleanup is underway. Lila and I should probably start looking for our own place." Richard felt panic rise in his chest. "Why? Has something happened? Have I done something to make you uncomfortable?" "No," Amara said quickly. "Nothing like that. It's just, we've been living here for months now, in your home, eating your food, accepting your generosity. At some point, we need to stand on our own feet again. What if I don't want you to leave?" The words tumbled out before Richard could stop them. "What if I asked you to stay? Not as my employee or my obligation, but as my family?" Amara looked at him, surprise and something else in her eyes. "Richard, I know I have no right to ask," he continued, the words rushing out. "I know our relationship started with you working for me, and there's a power imbalance there that I can never fully overcome. But these past months with you and Lila here, they've been the happiest I've had in years, since before Daniel died, maybe even before that." He took a deep breath. "This house was a mausoleum, Amara, cold and empty and filled with ghosts. You and Lila brought it back to life. You brought me back to life. I'm not asking for anything romantic or complicated. I'm just asking for you to consider staying. Let me be Lila's grandfather in everything but blood. Let me be your friend, if nothing else." Amara was quiet for a long time. Then she reached over and took his hand. "Lila asked me last week if you were her grandpa now," she said softly. "I told her family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about people who choose to love each other and stick together no matter what." She squeezed his hand. "We'll stay, Richard, if you're sure." "I've never been more sure of anything," Richard said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even known he was carrying. They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who had been brought together by tragedy and forged into family, by shared purpose and growing love. A year after the cemetery encounter that started everything, Richard stood once more before his son's grave. This time, it was a celebration. The 10th anniversary of Daniel's death. Yes, but also the anniversary of truth finally coming to light. Lila had organized a memorial gathering. Dozens of people came, people whose lives Daniel had touched. Patients from the clinic, families who received care from the foundation, workers from the community health center. They brought flowers and stories and tears and laughter. One by one, people shared memories of Daniel, the nurse who had worked with him, the homeless man he'd bought dinner for every Tuesday, the single mother whose kids he'd tutored for free. With each story, Richard discovered new facets of his son, pieces of the man Daniel had been when Richard wasn't watching. When it was his turn to speak, Richard found himself struggling for words. Finally, he simply said, "My son taught me that the measure of a life isn't what you build, but who you help." He died believing that truth matters more than power, that people matter more than profit. He was right about everything, and I was wrong. I only wish I'd told him that before I lost him. Lila came to stand beside him. She'd grown in the past year, shooting up several inches and losing some of her baby roundness, but her eyes still held that same wisdom and kindness that had struck Richard from the first moment. "You're telling him now," she said simply, "and he hears you. I know he does." As the gathering ended and people began to leave, Richard noticed one mourner he didn't recognize, an elderly woman in a wheelchair, being pushed by a younger man. As they passed Daniel's grave, the woman leaned forward and placed a single white rose on the headstone. "Excuse me," Richard said, approaching them. "Did you know my son?" The woman smiled, her eyes clouded with age but still bright with memory. "I'm Sarah Thompson. 20 years ago, when I was dying from cancer with no insurance, your son was just a medical student. He organized a fundraiser that paid for my treatment, saved my life." She gestured to the young man pushing her chair. This is my grandson. He just finished medical school, inspired by Dr. Montgomery's example. I wanted to pay my respects." Richard felt his throat close up. 20 years ago, Daniel would have been barely 18, just starting his own education, already saving lives, already making a difference. "Thank you for coming," Richard managed to say. "Thank you for sharing that with me." After they left, Richard stood alone at the grave for a moment. Lila and Amara waited patiently nearby, giving him space but ready to come closer if he needed them. "I see who you really were now," Richard whispered to the stone. "And I'm trying to become someone who would make you proud. I know I'll never be as good as you were, but I'm trying. With Amara and Lila's help, I'm trying." The wind rustled through the trees, warm and gentle like a caress. In that moment, Richard felt something he'd been searching for since that rainy afternoon when he first saw Lila crying here. Not forgiveness, exactly, because he wasn't sure he deserved that yet, but perhaps the beginning of peace. He turned and walked back to where his family waited. Amara smiled and took his arm. Lila slipped her hand into his. Together they walked out of the cemetery toward the car, toward home, toward whatever came next. Behind them, on Daniel's headstone, the memorial plaque Richard had added gleamed in the late afternoon sun. It bore Lila's words from her courtroom testimony, the words that had captured who Daniel truly was. Daniel Montgomery believed everyone deserves to live clean. He died protecting that truth. His legacy lives on in every life we choose to save, every wrong we choose to right, every moment we choose love over fear. And beneath that, one final line that Richard had added himself. "Forgive me, son, for taking so long to understand. I'm finally listening now." As they drove away from Evergreen Cemetery, Richard looked in the rearview mirror at Lila in the back seat. She was drawing again, always drawing, her crayon moving across paper in sure, confident strokes. "What are you making, sweetheart?" he asked. She held up the picture. It showed 3 people standing on a riverbank where the water ran clear and clean. The sun was shining, children were playing, and in the corner, barely visible like a blessing, was Daniel's smiling face. "It's called Tomorrow," Lila said, "because that's what Mr. Daniel gave us. A chance at tomorrow." Richard smiled, truly smiled, for what felt like the first time in years. She was right. Daniel had given them tomorrow, and Richard would spend all of his tomorrows making sure his son's sacrifice meant something. The Mercedes pulled away from the cemetery, carrying them toward home, toward healing, toward the future that Daniel had died to protect. And somewhere in the rustling leaves and warm sunlight, somewhere in the laughter of children and the hope of redemption, Daniel's spirit smiled and finally rested in peace. If you discovered that everything you built was destroying the very people you should have protected, would you have the courage to burn it all down and start over? Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more powerful stories about redemption, justice, and the truths we're afraid to face.